Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 232B. We're talking about war slang in this episode. So, I think we have maybe teased this one once or twice throughout the course of our narrative episodes. But we have talked about how there is kind of this, at least a limited amount, maybe not quite so much in terms of later wars, but there are certain words that are kind of these slang terms in the Civil War, and I kind of wanted to run them down. So I figured maybe that this would be an interesting episode. Maybe y'all would find this to be amusing, right? And I will kind of give a note on kind of the genesis of where this comes from and where I got this idea from. And I actually got a book when I was a kid. Can't remember if it was like a birthday or a Christmas, where it's written by Paul Dixon, and it's actually a war slang dictionary. And it's quite interesting. I do recommend it if it's something that sounds like it could be up your alley, but I would kind of flip through it, right, and read some of the words, and certainly there's kind of all kinds of different stuff in here, whether that's your Jaff dip, and if you're military and know what that one is, then I don't need to tell you. You can look that one up. If not, and that's kind of like from your modern military. And it goes all the way back to the Civil War, though. That's kind of where the war slang begins. So wanted to kind of go through some of these words and read off their definitions here, and maybe talk about a couple of them and put them in the context of some of these episodes that we've already gone through. The first one here, though, I do want to point out is not necessarily from the Civil War, doesn't originate there, but actually comes from before, and that's A1. And I will actually be going in alphabetical order, and I'll kind of put a pause, and maybe we'll pick it back up if everyone thinks it's interesting. But A1 is where I want to start here. Certainly, you've heard of A1 sauce, so A1 being prime, of the highest class, first rate in every respect. The expression did not originate in the classroom. It is derived from the classification of ships in Lloyd's Register in London, England. It first appeared as an adjective in 1837. The famous firm of underwriters described the quality of a ship's hull by a letter, and that of its equipment by number class. A1 means a ship of first-class condition as to both hull and equipment. The use of A1 exemplified a trend in this war to shorten and abbreviate. So that is very interesting there. I wanted to kind of start there. A1 is maybe something that we don't think about, but it is certainly makes sense. There's a lot of other interesting things that you can pull through, where if you're talking about an underwriter, if you know what that is from insurance, Lloyd's there in London is also kind of where that originated from, where if you were insuring these vessels, these shipping ventures, if you were trying to put down your information, or you're putting down your rate or whatever, or you were underwriting, right? You kind of had these notices, and then you were putting down your mark underneath them. So that's where that comes from. So the more you know. Here's another one, bummer. And we have actually talked about this and kind of teased this a little bit in the last sub-episode we did. A deserter, see also hospital bummer, an individual more interested in the spoils of war than in good conduct, or predatory soldier. A generic name of the destructive horde of deserters, stragglers, runaway slaves, and marauders who helped to make life miserable in the war-torn South. Bummers robbed, pillaged, and burned, along with General Sherman and his army in Georgia. These men were known far and wide as Sherman's bummers. The term was not shortened to bum until after the war. So there you go. You have another instance where you might think that someone is a bum, and maybe that's where that comes from. But of course, it's interesting that actually doesn't come till after the war. And that actually goes hand in hand with this one, so I'll read this one off as well. It's coffee boiler, coffee grinder as well. We talked about that. A malingerer, a shirker. Type is described in Morris Shaft's The Battle of Wilderness. A real adept skulker or coffee boiler is a most interesting specimen. How well I remember the coolness with which he and his companion, for they go in pairs, would rise from their little fires upon being discovered and ask innocently, "Lieutenant, can you tell us where the umpteenth regiment is?" And the answer, I'm sorry to say, was too often, "Yes, right up there at the front, you damn rascal, as well you know." Of course, they would make a show of moving, but were back at their little fires as soon as you were out of sight. So that kind of gives us two different, similar yet different terms. You know, you have your bummer and you also have your coffee boiler, coffee grinder. And there's a great, actually, anecdote of coffee grinders in Hardtack and Coffee, where they're all kind of in this, I believe actually might have been the Wilderness as well, where they're kind of in these set of trees and there's a artillery round that falls pretty close and then they're all kind of scatter, and it's kind of this humorous incident during the war that author talks about. You can also talk, you know, when you have this bummer, we can also kind of talk about how there is a very much a problem actually in the South with these individuals who are either pro-Union Southern men who are not wanting to be conscripted or escaped Union prisoners. There is a very large amount of those men as well who do kind of raid upon the populace there, and they're combating the Home Guard. And as we know in the South, the Home Guard requirements, age requirements, they keep getting adjusted so that it is younger and older throughout the war. So these individuals are not as adept at maybe combating a large band of individuals who are pretty hell-bent on not serving or not being captured again. And there are a lot of good accounts that I've read, and it's a side of the war that is not necessarily talked about too often, but there are a decent amount of accounts out there of these individuals and how much damage exactly they are going to inflict on the South. Two more B words here that we have kind of skipped over. One is big thing, any potentially notable event or achievement that has not come off as notable. In the Dictionary of Soldier Talk by John R. Etling, Dan Craig, and Ernest Steele, big thing is explained as something on the order of the mountain that labored and gave birth to a mouse, a big project that trips over its own feet. Big thing was sometimes howled in chorus, to the everlasting confusion of the recipient. General George McClellan was a big thing specialist. So, yes, there is kind of like this camp thought process, right? And certainly if you are serving with George B. McClellan, then maybe you are accustomed to this, or maybe there is a whole lot of marching done, and then, you know, there you don't really have a whole lot to show for it. And certainly the average Civil War soldier is no stranger to that kind of maneuvering, and there's a lot of waiting around and maybe a lot of build up toward these events. Then maybe there's not really a whole lot that happens after that, so we can understand a big thing. And I think there's a couple instances that I've seen of big thing that happen throughout the war, and a couple of them are in connection with McClellan and his Peninsula Campaign. And you can actually probably, in terms of this definition, you could probably throw out there that the Peninsula Campaign in general is a big thing, in that, you know, you get to Yorktown, you have the lines there, you're waiting for those siege guns. Joseph E. Johnson is going to withdraw his army. McClellan then moves on up. You do have Williamsburg and Eltham's Landing, and then you kind of stop outside of Richmond. You have Seven Pines, and then the campaign, at least that portion of the Peninsula Campaign, and kind of transitions into the 7 days. There's kind of a pause. So you can kind of connect those two things and work them fairly well together. Another one that I've actually seen a couple different places and maybe even read in certain accounts is blue light. And blue light is a traitor, an early American term still used during the Civil War, especially in the North. According to Robert Hendrickson in American Talk, it originated during the War of 1812 when pro-British Americans flashed blue lights to British ships off the coast as a signal that Commodore Stephen Decatur's two frigates would soon be sailing from their New London, Connecticut harbor. Now, I've actually seen that blue light a couple different places, and I also wanted to read this definition and this word because there is a connection. I don't know if you remember from our narrative episodes, but we talked way back when we were going through Big Bethel, Daniel Harvey Hill, and his math equations book, and those equations are kind of a hoot. I definitely recommend that if you didn't read those, go back and listen to that episode or go find them. They're online somewhere, and maybe I'll find those and we'll do one of these sub episodes on those in the future. But some of them are very much making fun of this particular kind of event. Because in the War of 1812, that's another thing that a lot of people don't necessarily think about, is that, in the American Revolution, there's a good amount of individuals who are still pro-crown. They are not necessarily in line with the Patriots, with the revolutionaries. And in the War of 1812, there are still kind of individuals around who are not in line with the fledgling United States. And then there are those especially in the northeastern portion of the United States, who are less than satisfied with how things are going. And there are those who maybe would welcome British rule once again. So Daniel Harvey Hill actually plays on that in one of his math equations when he talks about how there's a whole bunch of traitors there's a conference that happens where there are delegates from these different states that talk about that. And so, as you can imagine, Daniel Harvey Hill points out that these are all Union men who are going to be the traitors against the United States in this math equation. We'll just go ahead and read this one as well. It's bounty jumping. I know we've talked about that one before. That business in the North by which a man could take cash bounty to enlist as a substitute for another who had been called to serve, then desert, and enlist again as a substitute for another bounty. And his war memories of an army chaplain, H.C. Trumbull, recalled the custom. The dimension of this evil grew at a fearful rate. I speak of what came under my own observation when I say that substitutes enlisted and deserted 3, 5, and 7 times over, and in a single regiment 1/4 and again 1/2, and yet again a larger proportion of all the men assigned under the new call of the President for 500,000 more volunteers deserted within a few weeks of being started to the front. So that kind of gives you an idea as well of kind of the rampantness of this bounty jumping issue, and that we kind of talked about it all the way back when we did a memoir review for Frank Wilkerson. And again, it seemed like maybe it was a weird place to start in terms of our memoir reviews that we did. But it kind of gives us a good idea of a late war experience, and it set us up nicely as we had this progression through the war in terms of what we would expect later on. And one of those things was there is kind of this racket to be had with these men who are receiving these bounties, and they're taking the money and then they're able to finagle their way out. And certainly in New York, there's actually a guy that Frank will mention who he's on this boat that's headed out, but then he's able to actually kind of have this deal with these guards where then he's off the boat, and of course he's going to do it again. So that way he's going to get the money, and then he's paying off these guys. And certainly you can imagine that in these bounties, we've talked about them before, how they're like a year's wage, right? And that's part of the reason why it's difficult to be a substitute or to obtain a substitute. You have to be wealthy. And that's one of the reasons why you have this thought process that the war is being fought by the poor for the rich, in that the rich are the only ones who are going to be able to afford a year's wages for these individuals. And obviously there is kind of this incentive to be able to be paid to then go in one's stead, right? But then obviously there's definitely some money to be had then in that case, where you're constantly going to be able to game the system. Here's another good one that I actually haven't seen, and that's Bell the Cat. To encounter and cripple one of greater and superior force. From the fable of the mice resolving to place a bell on the cat. And that certainly is one where you could certainly see that as some kind of slang from the Civil War, Bell the Cat. And not one that I've actually seen in first-hand accounts, but it certainly makes sense. Bowlegs is another good one. It's a cavalryman. This is a somewhat derisive term for a cavalryman, and like all true slang is descriptive and figurative in origin. Because constant riding of horses is thought to bow his legs, the cavalryman has for years been called bowlegs. And obviously, you can connect how there might be a rivalry between service branches. You know, there's that saying, who has ever seen a dead cavalryman? And you have your bow legs, where you're talking about these cavalrymen they're riding all day. And if you're even if you are used to it, then certainly you might have a different appearance after having ridden all day on the horse. The last one that I do want to read today is By Hook or By Crook, by whatever means possible. And it's very short and sweet. Rounds out A and B for today. But By Hook or By Crook is another term that I've actually seen in some first-hand accounts. So that's a great connection. I like having this book of slang terms that we're then able to look at some of these first-hand accounts that I've seen and can really see how some of these terms are actually being used. By hook or by crook is definitely one that I've seen before. But by whatever means necessary, right? Any means possible. Really, that's enough said on that one. Makes sense to me. Once again, though, that's going to conclude A and B. I just kind of selected a few that I thought were interesting, whether I've heard them before or whether I haven't heard them before. So hopefully you thought that was interesting enough for us to continue. We can keep going through some of these other letters and keep talking about some war slang. And, you know, obviously special shout out to Paul Dixon and his book War Slang here. Definitely gave me a lot of enjoyment when I was a little bit younger, and I just kind of was flipping through this. I'd spend evenings just kind of looking through different terms that I could come up with, and maybe even use some of them. Some of them might not have been, I guess, appropriate to use in everyday conversation, but some of them maybe I could utilize. So if you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.